Hi Bobcats, I want to welcome you to something that is super special to all of us here at Buck Lake, and that is a recognition of our students that have done a great job during the second 9 weeks of the school year. Now I know the third 9 weeks is already halfway over, but we wanted to go back and really recognize kids that did a great job during the second 9 weeks. And so we're going to recognize students that have done a great job with effort and great job with leadership. And it was very tough for our teachers to decide the very top student in each class. But today I'm going to announce those winners, and they'll get a certificate just like this one. And if they were the best effort person, they'll get a pin just like this one. And if they showed the best leadership in the class, they'll get a pin just like this one. Our special area teachers have also selected students that have been giving their very best effort in special area, and we'll announce those as well. We look forward to being able to recognize students each 9 weeks, and if your name wasn't called this time, that's okay, because you have an opportunity to do that during the third 9 weeks and the fourth 9 weeks. Let's find out who our award recipients are right now. Our first category is leadership. Congratulations to these friends in pre-K and kindergarten who have shown great leadership. For Mrs. Ishley's class, Micah. For Mrs. Darden's class, Caleb. For Miss Gregory's class, Whitley. For Mrs. Kerner's class, Grayson. For Mrs. Lazarus's class, Ariella. For Mrs. Munoz's class, Jacoby. And from Mrs. Shank's class, JJ. In first grade, our students that are being recognized for their leadership abilities are, for Miss Howell's class, Finley. From Mrs. McLeod's class, Bo. From Mrs. McDermott's class, Sophie. From Miss Moore's class, Ethan. From Mrs. Oschlager's class, Charlie Sue. From Mrs. Stark's class, Anya. From Mrs. Threadgill's class, Abel. Congratulations, first graders. In second grade, our leaders are, from Mrs. Dameron's class, Ethan. From Mrs. Davis's class, Redhika. From Miss Herlihy's class, Dominic. From Mrs. Furman's class, Savannah. From Mrs. Register's class, Braden. And from Miss Williams' class, Bridget. In third grade, our leaders are, from Mrs. Connor's class, Rayansh. From Mrs. Ferris's class, Kenzie. From Mr. Jones's class, Ellis. From Mrs. Schmidt's class, Hunter. From Mrs. Tucker's class, Merrill. From Mrs. Vicks's class, Reagan. And from Mrs. Widener's class, Avery. In fourth grade, our leaders are, from Mrs. Craven's class, Monis. From Miss Ganaway's class, Landon. From Mr. Lasser's class, Sailor. From Mrs. Picnic's class, Nate. From Mrs. Ryan's class, Max. And from Mrs. Wells's class, Kaysen. Great job, fourth grade. Let's meet our leaders from fifth grade. In Mrs. Akos's class, Isabel. In Mrs. Bowie's class, Kavish. In Mrs. Doricki's class, Gavin. In Mrs. Doherty's class, Harrison. In Mr. Griffith's class, Brooks. And in Miss Bergman's class, Ezra. Our next category for awards is Best Effort. These are students that are giving their best every day in class. Let's meet our Best Effort Award winners in pre-K and kindergarten. From Mrs. Ishley's class, Pierce. From Mrs. Darden's class, Annabelle. From Miss Gregory's class, Melena. From Mrs. Kerner's class, Bryson. From Mrs. Lazarus's class, Andrew. From Mrs. Munoz's class, Mila. And from Mrs. Shank's class, Isla. In first grade, our students giving the best effort for the second 9 weeks are, from Mrs. Howell's class, Asher. From Mrs. McLeod's class, Paisley. From Mrs. McDermott's class, Sophia. From Miss Moore's class, Vera. From Mrs. Oschlager's class, Clara. From Mrs. Stark's class, Noel. And from Mrs. Threadgill's class, Addison. Great job, first grade. Our students in second grade who are being recognized for their effort for the second 9 weeks are, from Mrs. Dameron's class, Riley. From Mrs. Davis's class, Caden. From Miss Herlihy's class, Taj. From Mrs. Furman's class, Cedric. From Mrs. Register's class, Jackson. And from Miss Williams' class, Camden. In third grade, our students being recognized for their effort are, from Miss Connor's class, Piper. From Miss Ferris's class, Charlie. From Mr. Jones's class, Anastasia. From Mrs. Schmidt's class, Morgan. From Mrs. Tucker's class, Kylie. From Mrs. Vix's class, Emma. And from Mrs. Widener's class, Jordan. Great job, third grade. The students being recognized for their effort in fourth grade are, from Mrs. Craven's class, Sasha. From Miss Ganaway's class, Taylor. From Mr. Lassiter's class, Trenton. From Mrs. Picnic's class, Aria. From Mrs. Ryan's class, Brennan. And from Mrs. Wells's class, Blaine. In fifth grade, our students that are being recognized for their best effort are, from Mrs. Akos's class, Jakari. From Miss Bowie's class, Addie. From Mrs. Duricky's class, DC. From Mrs. Doherty's class, Mia. From Mr. Griffith's class, Oscar. And from Miss Bergman's class, Jackson. And now let's find out who's been giving their very best effort in our special area classes. For best effort in PE, we have from kindergarten, Valeria from Miss Shank's class, Jackson from Miss Bergman's class, Annabelle from Miss Darden's class. In first grade, we have Swara from Miss Threadgill's class and Vera Lynn from Miss Moore's class. In second grade, we have Savannah from Miss Furman's class and Bridget from Miss Williams's class. In third grade, we have Drew from Miss Widener's class and Piper from Mrs. Connor's class. In fourth grade, we have Georgia from Mrs. Picnic's class and Evelina from Mr. Lassiter's class. In fifth grade, we have Jack from Mrs. Akos's class and Oscar from Mr. Griffith's class. Best effort in art goes to, from kindergarten, Miriam from Mrs. Darden's class. First grade, Bo from Mrs. McLeod's class. Second grade, Hadley from Mrs. Dameron's class. In third grade, Nature from Mrs. Connor's class. Fourth grade, Elton from Miss Ganaway's class. And fifth grade, Anvita from Mrs. Akos's class. These students have shown best effort in music during the second 9 weeks. In kindergarten, Jameson from Mrs. Kerner's class. In first grade, Christy from Mrs. Threadgill's class. In second grade, Benchley from Miss Williams's class. In third grade, Victor from Mrs. Connor's class. In fourth grade, Genevieve from Miss Picnic's class. And in fifth grade, Sloan from Mrs. Akos's class. These students are being recognized for their outstanding effort in media. In kindergarten, Emery from Miss Gregory's class. In first grade, Seth from Miss Threadgill's class. In second grade, Keegan from Mrs. Furman's class. In third grade, Jackson from Mr. Jones's class. In fourth grade, Aria from Mrs. Picnic's class. And in fifth grade, Adriana from Miss Bowie's class. These students have shown outstanding effort in the guidance special area class. In kindergarten, Haley from Mrs. Darden's class. First grade, Harper from Mrs. Howell's class. And second grade, Anne from Miss Herlihy's class. These students have shown outstanding effort in the STEM special area class. In third grade, Mahika from Mrs. Widener's class. Fourth grade, Piper from Mrs. Ryan's class. And fifth grade, Lila from Mrs. Akos's class. Congratulations to all of our students that have been recognized for either showing outstanding leadership or outstanding effort during the second 9 weeks. If you did not have your name called this time, I challenge you to work really, really hard and be recognized in the third or fourth 9 weeks. I know you can do it. Thank you so much, Bobcats, for doing your best every day. Look forward to recognizing more students during the next 9 weeks.